For months, fans begged for her return. Last night they got it, and it broke the internet. You won't believe who just walked through that curtain. It was the predictable part of the show. The main event was set, the championship match we'd all seen advertised for weeks. The two competitors in the ring were giving it their all, but the air in the arena felt thin. It was the familiar, comfortable lull of sports entertainment. We knew the beats. We knew the rhythm. The champion would likely retain. The challenger would look strong in defeat. We would all go home, satisfied but not electrified. We were watching the script we had already read. And then the lights went out. It wasn't a flicker. It wasn't a technical glitch. It was a deliberate, suffocating plunge into total darkness. The ambient noise of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a sharp collective intake of breath. 20,000 people, silent, holding their breath in the void. The referee's count stopped. The music cut off mid-note. There was only the darkness. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. In that pressurized silence, a new sound emerged. Not music, not an explosion, just a single amplified sound. The click-clack of a high-heeled boot stepping onto the steel entrance ramp. It echoed through the arena like a gunshot. A sound that didn't belong. A sound from the past. The crowd wasn't cheering yet. They were frozen, suspended between confusion and a desperate, impossible hope. The ring, still dark, was forgotten. Every eye strained toward the entrance, waiting for a revelation they hadn't dared to ask for. Not really. Not tonight. The spotlight hit, and the sound that erupted was not a cheer. It was a roar of disbelief. It was the sound of thousands of people realizing their fantasy booking, their what-if scenarios, their desperate forum posts, had just materialized. She stood there, unmoving, bathed in white light. She hadn't aged. She hadn't changed. She was exactly as they remembered her from the day she vanished, leaving the championship in the center of the ring, walking away at the absolute peak of her power. In the arena, people were jumping. They were grabbing the strangers next to them. Grown men, faces painted for the current champion, were openly weeping. A close-up shot, now famous, caught a young woman holding her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide, tears streaming down her cheeks. She was shaking her head, as if trying to deny what she was seeing. Online, it was instantaneous chaos. The social media platforms didn't just bend, they snapped. Servers crashed. The global trending list became just her name, repeated 20 times. Every other sporting event, every political headline, every movie premiere, vaporized. Announcers were screaming, their professionalism shattered. They weren't commentators anymore. They were fans, just like the rest of us. They had no words, no script for this. They were just shouting her name over and over. This wasn't part of the show. This was the show. The entire landscape of the company, the entire future of the division, had been rewritten in the 3 seconds it took for that spotlight to find her. While the arena was convulsing, the real story was happening behind the curtain. Backstage, the atmosphere was different. It wasn't celebration. It was a morgue. The other women, the ones who had carried the division in her absence, the ones who had scratched and clawed to fill the vacuum she left, were huddled around the gorilla position monitor. Their faces were pale. This wasn't a happy reunion. This was an extinction-level event. The current champion, the woman who was supposed to be in the main event, had stopped lacing her boots. She just sat on the bench, staring at the screen. Her entire championship reign, all the grueling matches, the promos, the injuries, all of it was just rendered a prelude. She was no longer the main character in her own story. She was now just the person keeping the title warm. The anxiety was toxic. You could feel the silent calculations. What does this mean for my spot? Is my match at the pay-per-view still happening? She's going to take all the oxygen. It was the cold, hard math of the business. One person's triumphant return is another person's demotion. One person's miracle is another person's pink slip. There was no cheering. There was no clapping. There was only the stunned, heavy silence of professionals who knew the game board had just been violently flipped over. The ghost they all defined themselves against, the shadow they could never quite escape, was no longer a shadow. She was flesh and blood, and she was standing on their stage. But what was she feeling? We saw the icon. We saw the savior. We saw the one who had come back to fix everything. But she felt the noise hit her like a physical force. It wasn't uplifting. It was terrifying. The sound was a crushing weight. 20,000 people were screaming at a memory. They weren't cheering her, the person who had spent the last 2 years in physical therapy, the person who woke up every morning with a dull ache in her shoulder, the person who had cried in her car, convinced she would never be that strong again. They were cheering for the idea of her, the undefeated, the untouchable, the empress. And in that moment, walking down that ramp, she had never felt more human or more fraudulent. Every step was a negotiation with doubt. Can I still do this? Am I still her? The person they are screaming for? What if she doesn't exist anymore? What if she died on an operating table? The pressure was unbearable. To not just return, but to be the savior they demanded, to live up to the legend that had grown in her absence. Her own legacy had become her greatest opponent, an undefeated phantom she now had to face. The smile she gave, the one that broke the internet, wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a mask. It was the armor she put on to face the impossible expectation she had just walked back into. The roar was deafening, but inside her head it was completely, terrifyingly silent. The moment she stepped through the curtain, the narrative of the entire industry shattered. It wasn't just a wrestling story, it was a global media event. Inside press boxes, journalists threw their prepared scripts in the trash. The main event recap they were writing was deleted. This was the only story. Frantic phone calls were made to editors. Stop the presses. You are not going to believe this. Websites that specialized in rumors and inside news were caught completely flat-footed. Their sources had known nothing. They were exposed. It was a moment of pure, unpredictable magic, and in the modern, all-knowing internet age, that was impossible. Pundits, the ones who made their living analyzing the product, were left scrambling. Their carefully constructed arguments about the current champion's reign, about the state of the division, were now obsolete. They were forced to react in real time, their authority evaporating as they stammered, just as shocked as any fan. And the company? The stock price flickered. Mentions went up not by percentages, but by multiples of 10,000. The marketing department was in a state of euphoric panic. How do you capitalize on lightning? How do you bottle a miracle? They had just been handed the biggest promotional gift in a decade, a moment so powerful it transcended their own brand. This wasn't a planned marketing beat. This was a cultural reset. The return wasn't just a surprise. It was a fundamental shift in the balance of power, not just in the ring, but in the entire media ecosystem that surrounded it. Thousands of miles away, in a quiet house, the television was on. Her family wasn't watching as fans. They were watching as survivors. They were the only ones who knew the full story. They were the ones who had seen her on the days she couldn't get out of bed, the ones who had held her when the doctors gave her the bad news, the ones who drove her to rehab before the sun came up, day after day, for 2 solid years. They knew the cost. They knew the chronic pain. They knew the nightmares. When the lights went out in the arena, her mother stopped breathing. Her father gripped the arm of the chair, his knuckles white. They weren't watching a superstar return. They were watching their daughter walk back into the very thing that broke her. And when that spotlight hit and the crowd erupted, they didn't cheer. Her mother let out the breath she'd been holding, and it sounded more like a sob. It was relief. It was fear. It was a profound, heartbreaking pride. While the internet was celebrating the return of an icon, this family was watching a woman they loved step back into the fire. They saw the way she held her shoulder. They saw the slight hesitation in her step. They saw the mask she was wearing. For the world, it was the return of a queen. For them, it was the end of a long, terrifying, and private war. They just hoped, prayed, that she had enough strength left for the new one she had just started. The confetti from the scheduled main event never fell. The champion, who was supposed to be celebrating her hard-fought victory, instead stormed down the ramp, her title clutched in her hand like a weapon. The arena was electric. This was it. The past versus the present. The ghost versus the machine. But when they stood face to face, something was different. There was no screaming. There was no cheap shoving match. The champion, the Red Queen who had ruled in the absence, was vibrating with a complex fury. She wasn't angry that she was interrupted. She was angry that she was irrelevant. She held up the championship belt. "This is mine," she spat, the microphone picking up the raw desperation in her voice. "I bled for this. I carried this division while you were gone. You don't get to just walk back in and take my place." The returned hero, let's call her the Empress, just looked at her. She didn't look at the title. She looked directly into the champion's eyes. The crowd was screaming for a fight, but the Empress simply, slowly, shook her head. She didn't grab a microphone. She didn't need to. She just leaned in close, her voice audible only to the champion and the ringside camera. "I'm not here for your place," she whispered. "I'm here for mine." It was a devastating checkmate. It wasn't a challenge. It was a statement of fact. The champion's reign, her identity, was erased in a single sentence. The belt she was holding suddenly looked like a toy. The show ended with her image, her music playing, the arena chanting her name. It was a perfect, triumphant comeback. An hour later, the building was almost empty. The trucks were being loaded. The fans were gone. The Empress sat alone in her private locker room. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a cold, seismic ache. Her shoulder throbbed. Her knee was stiff. She had her bag of ice, the same routine as before, but it felt different. She pulled out her phone. The screen lit up with thousands of notifications. "You saved us." "The Queen is back." "The show is good again." "Thank you, thank you, thank you." She read them, and she felt nothing. She felt a profound, isolating emptiness. They had no idea. They saw the miracle, but they didn't see the cost. They didn't see the surgeon's bill. They didn't see the doubt. She had just given them the greatest moment of the year, and in return, they had just handed her a mountain she wasn't sure she could climb. She was trapped. She couldn't be human. She couldn't be in recovery. She had to be the Empress. A single tap came at the door. Not a knock, just a quiet tap. She looked up, her face exhausted. The mask was off. "Come in," she said, her voice small. It wasn't a producer. It wasn't the champion. It was the last person anyone would have expected. The Red Queen she had just humiliated in the ring. The champion stood in the doorway, not with her title, but with her own bag of ice. She didn't look angry anymore. She just looked tired. Why now? Why this city? Why that specific moment? The fans believed it was magic. The pundits called it a desperate masterstroke. The truth, as it always is, was somewhere in the middle. The company was struggling. Ticket sales were down. The buzz was gone. The current champion, for all her talent, wasn't connecting. The machine was grinding to a halt. The executives looked at the data, the focus groups, the tumbling network subscriptions, and they knew they needed a reset. They needed a miracle. So they made the call. It wasn't a request. It was a plea. They showed her the numbers. "We need you," they said. "The division you built is collapsing. Your legacy is fading." They offered her the money. They offered her the schedule. But what really got her was the narrative. The idea that everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed her body to build, was turning to dust without her. The return wasn't just her choice. It was a burden they placed on her. The interruption, the spotlight, the confrontation, it was all meticulously planned. They needed her to be the savior. They needed her to invalidate the current champion. They needed her to reignite the fire. She had agreed. She had agreed to come back. to take the pressure, to wear the crown. She agreed to be the hero, but she had one condition, one part of the script that they didn't get to write, one move that was hers and hers alone. They were so desperate, they agreed without even asking what it was. The internet was buzzing about the inevitable title match. The Empress versus the Red Queen. The past versus the present. It was the easiest story to tell, but they had all missed the point. In that quiet locker room, the Red Queen didn't say anything. She just sat down, 2 feet away from the Empress, and put her own bag of ice on her knee. 2 warriors broken down by the same machine, sitting in silence. The Empress finally spoke. "It wasn't real," she said, her voice quiet. "What I said out there, it was just for them." The Red Queen nodded. She looked at the woman she was supposed to hate. "I know," she replied, but they believed it. The Empress looked at her, and for the first time all night her face softened. "They'll believe what we tell them to believe," she said, and that was the twist. The return wasn't about a confrontation. It was about a conspiracy. The media, the fans, the company executives, they all saw an old lion returning to put the young cub in her place. They were wrong. The one condition the Empress had, the one move the company didn't see coming, it wasn't to replace the new generation. It was to unite with them. The internet-breaking moment wasn't the return. It was this, the quiet, unseen alliance, the realization that the real enemy wasn't the person across the ring, but the system that demanded they destroy each other for the entertainment of the crowd. The Empress hadn't returned to reclaim her throne. She had returned to flip the whole chessboard over, and she had just recruited the most powerful piece on the board to help her do it.